The snow fell like scattered bones across the Dakota territory, each flake carrying the weight of winter's cruelest promise. Tashunka Red Elk pressed himself against the granite outcropping, his weathered hands trembling not from cold, but from the dream that had haunted him for 3 nights running. In the vision, 4 small figures huddled against a howling storm, their cries echoing the last sounds his own daughter had made before the cavalry bullets found her. Winona's voice sweet as summer rain, pleading for her papa to save her. But he had been too far away, too slow, too late. Just as he had been too late to save his wife, Ayanna, whose blood had stained the snow, much like the crimson drops he now saw scattered near his feet. Fresh blood, still warm enough to melt the snow around it. Red Elk dropped to one knee, studying the scarlet trail that led toward the creek bed. Someone had passed here recently, wounded and moving fast. Behind him, carried on the bitter wind, came the distant baying of hunting dogs, not the casual barking of farm animals, but the purposeful howling of hounds following a scent. The vision pulled at him again, stronger now. 4 children, their faces blurred by snow, and tears crying out for help that might never come. His daughter's voice whispered in the wind, "Save them, Papa. Save the ones you couldn't save before." Red Elk's scarred fingers touched the medicine pouch at his belt, feeling the small stones and herbs that carried the prayers of his people. At 32, he had survived cavalry charges, blizzards that killed grown men, and the kind of grief that could hollow out a warrior's chest. The jagged scar across his left cheek, earned when soldiers had tried to scalp him at Wounded Knee, pulled tight in the frozen air. But grief was a luxury he couldn't afford now. Somewhere ahead, following the blood trail, death was stalking the innocent. The tent appeared through the swirling snow, like a broken wing canvas torn and stained with more than weather. No smoke rose from its peak, no adult voices called out against the storm. But from within came a sound that stopped Red Elk's heart, the weak crying of a child growing fainter with each passing moment. He approached with a hunter's caution, every sense alert for the trap this might be. The dogs were closer now, their baying mixing with men's voices, shouting commands. Boot prints surrounded the tent, at least 6 different sets, all leading away toward the deeper wilderness. Red Elk pulled back the tent flap and felt his world tilt. 4 children lay tangled together beneath blankets that were more holes than fabric, and their lips blue-black with cold and their breathing shallow and desperate. The youngest, a girl who couldn't have seen more than 7 winters, clutched a corn-husk doll with fingers that barely moved. Frozen tears had formed ice crystals on her cheeks. "Jesus," Red Elk whispered, then repeated it in Lakota, "Wakantanka, give me strength." The oldest boy opened eyes that held too much knowledge for someone so young. His gaze fixed on Red Elk's copper skin and the long black hair, the traditional winter clothing that marked him unmistakably as Lakota. Fear flickered in those young eyes, not of cold or hunger, but of another kind of predator. "Please," the boy whispered through chattering teeth. Don't let them find us. They killed Papa. They killed everyone who tried to help." Red Elk knelt beside them, his hands moving quickly to check pulses and breathing. The boy was Samuel's Sammy, he said. The girl beside him, perhaps 10, was Agnes. Another girl, maybe 9, whispered her name as Elsie, with eyes that seemed far too old. And the youngest, the one with the doll, was Ruth. "Who killed your papa?" Red Elk asked gently, but Sammy's eyes were already closing, exhaustion pulling him back toward unconsciousness. The howling of the hunting dogs grew louder, closer. Red Elk could hear men's voices now, rough and determined, calling out coordinates and search patterns. They were being hunted like animals, these children, and the hunters were closing in. "How long have you been running?" Red Elk asked as he began wrapping the children in his own blankets. "Other 3 days," Agnes managed to say. "Maybe 4. Papa hid us in the root cellar when they came. We heard them talking about not letting us reach the territorial marshal." Red Elk felt ice form in his veins. These weren't just lost children, they were witnesses to something significant enough to kill for. He gathered the heated stones from the tent's dying fire, wrapping them in cloth and pressing them against the children's bodies. "Can you walk?" he asked Sammy urgently. The boy tried to nod, but his legs buckled when he attempted to stand. The other children were in even worse condition, little Ruth barely conscious, despite the warmth he was trying to restore to her small body. Through the tent wall, Red Elk could see the flickering glow of torches moving between the trees. The hunters had found their trail, and they were methodical in their approach. Professional. This wasn't a simple posse, and these were men who knew how to track human prey. "There's a place," Red Elk said, lifting Ruth in his arms while helping Elsie to her feet. "Not far. Warmer than this." He remembered a shallow cave his grandfather had shown him years ago, hidden among the rock formations that dotted this stretch of prairie. The Lakota had used it as a hunting shelter for generations. If they could reach it before the hunters found them. "Listen to me carefully," he told them as they prepared to leave the tent. "We move quietly. Stay close. Do exactly what I tell you. And if something happens to me, you keep running toward the rising sun until you find the territorial marshal." 3 small heads nodded with the gravity of children who had learned that obedience meant survival. As they began their desperate journey through the snow-laden forest, Red Elk caught sight of movement on the distant ridge riders, at least 4 of them moving with the purposeful gait of men on a mission. Too far to make out faces, but close enough to confirm his worst fears. The children weren't just running from local trouble. They were being hunted by an organized force with resources and determination that spoke to crimes larger than simple robbery or revenge. Behind them, the hunting dogs found the abandoned tent and howled their triumph to the stars. The chase was about to begin in earnest, and Red Elk knew that this time, unlike 5 years ago when his family had died, he would not fail to protect the innocent, even if it cost him everything. Sheriff Boone Morrison reined in his horse at the edge of Willow Creek, his breath forming angry clouds in the frigid air. At 48, he was a man who had learned that power came from controlling information, and right now precious information was slipping through his fingers like water through cracked ice. 6 hours, he muttered to Deputy Caleb Morse, who sat hunched in his saddle like a man expecting bullets from every shadow. 6 goddamn hours, and we still haven't found them. Morse shifted nervously, his perpetual twitch more pronounced in the cold. "Sheriff, maybe we should consider that they might have frozen to death out there. Kids that young in this weather. They better not have." Morrison's voice carried the dangerous edge that had kept him in power for 15 years. "Dead kids can't tell us where they hid that letter, can they?" The deputy fell silent, but Morrison could see the questions in his eyes. The same questions that had been eating at Morrison's gut since they discovered Thomas Hartwell's children had escaped the massacre at their homestead. Hartwell had been a problem from the moment he'd arrived in Deadwood Gulch with his 4 children and his inconvenient sense of moral outrage. The shopkeeper had started asking questions about the wagon trains that passed through town in the dead of night, about the families that seemed to vanish without explanation, about the unusual cooperation between Sheriff Morrison and certain prominent businessmen. Most troubling of all, Hartwell had begun to piece together the truth about what really happened to that Lakota village 5 years ago. Morrison's hand moved instinctively to the Colt .45 at his hip. The arrangement he had with Jonas Pike had brought prosperity to Deadwood Gulch, had turned a struggling frontier town into a thriving hub of commerce. The fact that some of that commerce happened to involve human beings was simply the cost of progress. Sheriff called Jim Wade, one of the men Morrison had recruited for this particular expedition. "Got something here?" Wade was pointing to a set of tracks that led away from the creek bed toward the rocky hills beyond boot prints adult-sized, but with a distinctive pattern of moccasins. Morrison felt his blood pressure spike. Indian tracks meant complications he couldn't afford. "How many?" "Just 1 set, but deep. Like he was carrying something heavy." Or someone, Morrison thought grimly, If one of the local Lakota had found the children, it would complicate everything. The territorial government was already breathing down his neck about relations with the tribes. Could be Red Elk, said Bart Crenshaw, a grizzled hunter who knew the local tribes better than most whites. He's been seen in this area before. Keeps to himself mostly, but he's got a reputation. Morrison knew the name. Tashunka Red Elk had survived the cavalry raid that was supposed to have eliminated potential troublemakers from the area. The official report had blamed the Lakota for stealing horses, but Morrison knew the truth was more complicated. Dangerous? Morrison asked. Crenshaw spat into the snow. Depends on your definition. He won't start trouble, but he'll damn sure finish it. Lost his wife and kid in that cavalry business a few years back. Been carrying a grudge ever since. Morrison's jaw tightened. The cavalry raid had been his idea, a convenient way to clear troublesome Indians off land that Pike needed for his operations. If Red Elk had the children, if he learned what was really in that letter. But here's the thing about Red Elk. Crenshaw continued, unaware of the storm brewing in Morrison's expression. He's got a soft spot for kids. Might not hand them over willing, especially if he thinks we mean them harm. We don't mean them harm. Morrison said, his voice carrying the weight of repeated lies. We're trying to rescue them from a dangerous savage who's kidnapped them. Morse shifted uncomfortably. Sheriff, what if he's just trying to help? What if nothing? Morrison cut him off. Caleb, let me explain something about the nature of our situation. Those children are carrying evidence that could destroy everything we've built here. Everything that keeps this territory safe and prosperous. Do you understand what that means? The deputy nodded quickly, but Morrison could see he didn't really comprehend the scope of the disaster they were facing. It means, Morrison continued, that anyone who gets between us and those children is an enemy regardless of their intentions. It means that sometimes good men have to make hard choices to protect the greater good. He gestured toward the moccasin tracks in the snow. That Indian may think he's being a hero, but he doesn't understand the larger picture. He doesn't know that everything we've built here depends on keeping certain truths buried. Morrison pulled out his pocket watch, noting they had perhaps 4 hours of darkness left. The longer this dragged out, the more complicated it would become. Jim, take 3 men and circle north. Bart, you and 2 others swing south. Caleb and I will follow these tracks directly. As the men began to spread out, Morrison called after them. Remember, this is about rescuing white children from a dangerous savage. That's the story we tell afterward, and that's the story we stick to. But as he spurred his horse toward the moccasin tracks, Morrison was already calculating the odds that bringing the children back alive would be an option. The letter was the only thing that mattered now, and dead children couldn't testify about what they had seen or heard. It was harsh arithmetic, but Morrison had been doing harsh arithmetic for 15 years. It's what had kept him alive, kept him in power, and what would keep him free, even if it meant crossing lines that other men might consider unthinkable. The abandoned trading post loomed out of the swirling snow, like a broken promise, its log walls weathered gray by years of Dakota winters. Red Elk had been moving the children through the wilderness for nearly 3 hours, carrying Ruth on his back, while the others stumbled through drifts that sometimes reached their waists. Is this the safe place? Sammy asked, his young voice tight with exhaustion and growing despair. Red Elk studied the building with the careful attention of a warrior who had learned that survival often depended on reading the signs others missed. The trading post had been built by French trappers 20 years ago, back when the fur trade was booming and territorial boundaries were still fluid. Now it stood empty, a testament to changing times. But he remembered it had been well stocked with preserved foods and supplies. More importantly, it had thick walls and a loft that would be difficult to search thoroughly. It's safer than where we were, he replied, though safety was a relative term when professional hunters were tracking you through winter wilderness. The door hung open, creaking in the wind, and snow had drifted inside the main room. But there were supplies, cans of preserved meat sacks of flour and beans that might still be edible, even some old blankets that would serve their purpose, despite the smell of mildew and mouse droppings. Up there, Red Elk pointed to the loft accessible by a wooden ladder, quiet as sleeping rabbits. As the children climbed, he quickly gathered what supplies they might need and scanned the building for defensive positions. The narrow windows could be watched from the loft. There was only one door, and the thick walls would stop most rifle fire. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than being caught in the open. Ruth stirred in his arms as he carried her up to the loft, opening her eyes for the first time since they'd left the tent. "Mama," she whispered, her voice heartbreakingly small. Red Elk felt something break inside his chest, a wound that had never properly healed tearing open again. "Shh, little star, you're safe now." But even as he said it, he could hear the sound that had been haunting them all night, distant voices growing closer, the methodical calls of men conducting a systematic search. "They found our trail?" Elsie said, her young face pale but determined. Through the gaps in the wooden walls, they could see the orange glow of torches moving between the trees. Red Elk nodded grimly. "Listen to me carefully. Whatever happens, you stay hidden until it's safe. Don't make any noise, don't move unless the building is on fire." "What about you?" Agnes asked, her voice small but steady. Red Elk checked his rifle, making sure it was loaded and ready. The Winchester had been a gift from a trader who'd appreciated his knowledge of safe passages through hostile territory. Tonight, it might be all that stood between 4 innocent children and the men who wanted them dead. "I'm going to make sure they don't find you," he said simply. Through the window, he could see at least 8 separate torches now moving with the methodical precision of experienced hunters. These weren't angry townspeople looking for lost children. These were professionals who knew how to surround a building and cut off all escape routes. The first torch appeared at the forest's edge, just as Red Elk settled the children in the deepest corner of the loft, behind a stack of old fur pelts that would help muffle any sounds they might make. "Spread out," a voice commanded from the darkness, a voice that carried the authority of someone used to being obeyed without question. "Check every building, every root cellar, every place big enough to hide a mouse. They're here somewhere." Red Elk recognized something in that voice that made his blood run cold. It was the casual confidence of a man who considered himself untouchable, who expected his orders to be followed regardless of their moral weight. "Red Elk," the voice boomed across the clearing. "We know you're in there. Send out the children and we'll let you ride away." The trading post remained silent, except for the whisper of wind through broken chinking. "You got 5 minutes," the voice called out again. "Then we come in, and we come in ready for trouble." Red Elk positioned himself at the edge of the loft, his rifle trained on the door below. He had fought cavalry soldiers and survived winter storms, but this moment felt different. This time, he wasn't just fighting for his own survival. He was fighting for the future of 4 children who had already lost everything. Through the gaps in the wall, he caught sight of something that made his heart sink. The man giving orders wore a sheriff's badge, and beside him stood a well-dressed figure who could only be the businessman Red Elk had heard about in trading post gossip Jonas Pike. The corruption went all the way to the top. "Time's up," Sheriff Morrison shouted. The assault came from 3 directions at once. Men rushed through the front door, while others smashed through the windows on either side. Red Elk's rifle boomed in the enclosed space, and one of the attackers spun backward, clutching his shoulder as blood seeped between his fingers. Up in the loft, someone shouted, and the confined space erupted in chaos. Red Elk had positioned himself behind a stack of trading goods, using them as cover, while he fired down at the men flooding through the openings. His second shot shattered a torch, plunging half the room into flickering shadows that made targeting difficult for both sides. "Don't kill him yet," Morrison's voice boomed from the doorway. "We need to know where that letter is." Bullets splintered the wooden walls around Red Elk, sending deadly fragments flying through the air. He shifted position, constantly working the lever action of his rifle and sending careful shots into the chaos below. But there were too many of them, and they were spreading out, making it impossible to cover all angles. A bullet grazed his left shoulder, spinning him partially around and sending fire through his arm. Red Elk gritted his teeth and kept firing, but he could feel warm blood soaking through his shirt. That's when he heard the sound that made his blood freeze, a child's scream from outside the building. Through the window, Red Elk could see figures moving in the pre-dawn darkness. Morrison had posted men around the perimeter, and they had caught some of the children trying to escape through the back window. "Got 2 of them," someone shouted from outside. "The other 2 are still inside." Red Elk's heart hammered against his ribs. Which children had been caught? Were they hurt? The not knowing was worse than the bullets flying around him. "Bring them in," Morrison commanded. "Let our friend up there see what happens to children who don't cooperate." The rage that flooded through Red Elk was unlike anything he had ever experienced. It was clean and pure, and absolutely without mercy, the kind of fury that had driven Lakota warriors to impossible victories against overwhelming odds. His rifle roared again and again, each shot finding its mark. 2 more of Morrison's men went down, one silent and still the other howling as he clutched his shattered leg. The surviving attackers scrambled for cover behind the trading post's sparse furniture, but the advantage was temporary. Red Elk could hear Morrison entering the building, his voice carrying the authority of a man who held all the cards. "Red Elk," the sheriff called up toward the loft. "I've got 2 of your little friends down here. You want to see them again in one piece, you come down with your hands up." Red Elk peered through the gaps in the floor and felt his heart clench. Morrison had indeed captured Agnes and Sammy. The 2 children were being held by armed men, their young faces pale with terror, but their eyes still defiant. But where were Elsie and Ruth? "You've got 30 seconds. Morrison continued. "After that, I start demonstrating what happens to people who interfere with official business." Red Elk saw one of the men press a gun to Sammy's temple, and the boy's face went white. But there was something else in the child's expression, a desperate message he was trying to communicate with his eyes. Then Red Elk noticed subtle movement near the back wall of the trading post, where a section of logs had been damaged by weather and time. There was a gap there, barely visible in the shadows, but large enough for small bodies to squeeze through. Elsie and Ruth had found another way out. "Time's up," Morrison shouted. Red Elk made his choice with the clarity that came in moments of absolute crisis. He couldn't save all of them by surrendering, but he might save some by fighting. "I'm coming down," he called out, making his voice sound defeated. "Don't hurt them." But instead of heading for the ladder, Red Elk moved quickly toward the back of the loft. If he could get outside, circle around the building, maybe he could create enough chaos to give the children a chance. A second bullet caught him in the side as he squeezed through the gap in the wall, and he nearly cried out from the pain. Blood was flowing freely now, weakening him with each heartbeat, but he couldn't stop. Not when children's lives hung in the balance. He dropped to the ground outside the trading post and immediately spotted what he was looking for. Elsie crouched behind a fallen log with little Ruth in her arms, both of them shaking with cold and terror. "Stay hidden," he whispered urgently, "no matter what happens." But as he prepared to circle back toward the front of the building, Red Elk heard something that changed everything. The sound of a horse approaching fast through the snow. Through the swirling white, a familiar figure materialized like an answer to desperate prayer. Amos Price, the old trapper, who had always dealt fairly with the Lakota, was riding hard toward the trading post with his rifle already drawn. Their eyes met across the distance, and Red Elk saw understanding pass between them. Price had been following the sounds of gunfire, and he had arrived at the crucial moment. But as Price dismounted and took position behind a large pine tree, Red Elk caught sight of something that made his blood turn to ice. Pinned to Price's coat, barely visible in the firelight, was a silver star, a deputy marshal's badge. Amos Price wasn't just a helpful trapper. He was a federal law enforcement officer, and Red Elk suddenly understood why Morrison had seemed so confident, so certain that this night would end in his favor. The trap was even larger than he had imagined. Amos. Morrison's voice carried clearly through the night air. About time you got here, the savages holed up in the loft with the other two kids. Price's weathered face was unreadable in the flickering torchlight, but his rifle remained trained on the trading post. Morrison, what's the situation? Red Elk killed 3 of my men and kidnapped 4 white children. Morrison shouted back. We need to end this before he hurts them. Red Elk felt the world tilt around him. If Amos Price was working with Morrison, if the federal authorities were part of the conspiracy, then there was nowhere to run, no higher power to appeal to. The children would die, and the truth would die with them. But then Price did something unexpected. Instead of joining the assault on the trading post, he called out, Red Elk, can you hear me? Red Elk remained silent, uncertain whether this was another trap. I know you're out there, Price continued. I know you've got good reason not to trust any of us right now. But I need you to listen to me very carefully. There was something in the old trapper's voice, a tone Red Elk had never heard before, weighted with authority and what sounded like genuine urgency. I've been tracking Morrison's operation for 6 months. Price announced his words, carrying clearly through the cold air. I know about the trafficking, the murders, the cavalry raid on your village. I know about Thomas Hartwell's letter. Morrison's face went pale in the torchlight. Amos, what the hell are you talking about? I'm talking about the fact that you're under arrest, Boone. Price replied calmly. You, Pike, and every man who's been part of this conspiracy. The clearing erupted in chaos as Morrison's men realized they had been betrayed by their own ally. Some tried to run, others raised their weapons toward Price, and still others seemed frozen by the sudden reversal of fortune. The children. Red Elk shouted, forgetting stealth, as he saw Agnes and Sammy still being held at gunpoint inside the trading post. That's when Jonas Pike appeared in the doorway, his expensive suit rumpled and his face twisted with desperate rage. In his hand was a lit torch, and his eyes held the fanatic gleam of a man whose entire world was collapsing. If I can't have the letter, Pike snarled, then nobody can. He threw the torch into the trading post, and flames immediately began to spread across the dry wooden walls and scattered supplies. In seconds, the entire building would be an inferno. No, Red Elk roared, launching himself toward the burning building despite his wounds. But Pike wasn't finished. As Red Elk reached the doorway, the businessman raised a pistol and fired. The bullet caught Red Elk in the chest, spinning him around and sending him crashing to the ground just outside the building. Through the haze of pain and approaching unconsciousness, Red Elk could hear the children screaming inside the burning trading post. He tried to get up, tried to reach them, but his body wouldn't respond. This was how it would end then. Just like 5 years ago, he would fail to protect the innocent. The children would die, and their deaths would be on his hands forever. But then he heard something that gave him hope. Even as darkness closed around his vision, the sound of Amos Price's rifle booming again and again, and the old trapper's voice shouting orders to men Red Elk hadn't known were there. Get those children out of there, move. The federal marshals had been hiding in the forest, waiting for Price's signal. The trap had been for Morrison, not for Red Elk and the children. As consciousness faded, Red Elk felt strong hands pulling him away from the flames, heard familiar voices calling his name. Somewhere in the chaos, children were crying, but they were alive. They were safe. The last thing he saw before the darkness claimed him was little Ruth's face streaked with tears and soot, but wonderfully impossibly alive. She was holding her corn-husk doll in one hand and reaching toward him with the other. Don't leave us, she whispered. Please don't leave us. Red Elk tried to speak to tell her he would never leave them, that he would fight death itself to stay with them. But the words wouldn't come, and the darkness was too strong. All he could do was hold on to the sound of their voices and pray to the spirits of his ancestors that he had done enough, that this time the innocent would survive. Pain was the first thing Red Elk felt as consciousness slowly returned, a deep, throbbing ache that seemed to radiate from his chest through every fiber of his being. The second thing he noticed was warmth, blessed warmth that meant he was no longer lying in the snow. "Easy," a familiar voice said gently. "Don't try to move just yet." Red Elk opened his eyes to find himself in what appeared to be a clean, well-appointed room, with whitewashed walls and a proper bed. Beside him sat a man he didn't immediately recognize, middle-aged, with graying hair, and the kind of steady gaze that marked him as someone accustomed to authority. "I'm Marshal William Crawford," the man said, noting Red Elk's confusion. "You've been unconscious for 3 days. The doc says you're lucky to be alive. 3 bullet wounds, significant blood loss, and exposure to boot." Memory came flooding back in a rush. The children, the burning trading post, Amos Price's revelation about being a federal marshal. The children. Red Elk managed to croak his throat raw and dry. "Safe," Crawford assured him immediately. "All 4 of them are safe. Elsie and Ruth never left your side, actually. Had to practically drag them away to eat and sleep." As if summoned by his words, the door to the room opened, and 4 familiar faces peered inside. Agnes entered first, followed by Sammy, then Elsie, carrying little Ruth in her arms. All of them looked clean and fed and rested, but their eyes held the lingering shadows of trauma. Red Elk. Ruth's voice was bright with joy as she wiggled out of Elsie's arms and rushed to his bedside. "We thought you were going to die." "So did I," Red Elk admitted, managing a weak smile as he reached out to touch her face. "But I promised to keep you safe. And I always keep my promises. Even when you're bleeding all over the place," Sammy said with the forced bravado of a boy trying not to cry. "Especially then," Red Elk replied. Marshal Crawford cleared his throat gently. "I hate to interrupt the reunion, but there are some things we need to discuss. About what happened and about what comes next." Red Elk nodded, though the movement made his head spin slightly. "Morris and Pike, dead, both of them," Crawford said grimly. "Pike died in the fire he started. Morrison took a bullet when he tried to shoot his way out of the marshal's custody. Probably saved the territory the cost of a trial." "And Amos?" Red Elk asked, remembering the moment when he'd thought his friend had betrayed him. "Deputy Marshal Amos Price has been working undercover for 6 months to expose the trafficking ring," Crawford explained. "He's the one who alerted us to Morrison's operation in the first place. When he learned that Thomas Hartwell had been murdered and his children were being hunted, he sent word for federal marshals to move in." Relief flooded through Red Elk. Amos hadn't betrayed him. After all, the old trapper had been playing a dangerous game to bring down the corruption from within. "There's more," Crawford continued. "The letter that Hartwell wrote contained detailed evidence about the trafficking operation, including names, dates, and financial records. We've arrested 17 people so far, and we expect more arrests as the investigation continues." Elsie stepped forward, her young face serious. "What about the other part, the part about what happened to Red Elk's family?" Crawford's expression grew somber. "That too. We have documentation proving that the cavalry raid on the Lakota village was orchestrated by Morrison and Pike to clear land for their operations. Captain Harrison, who led the raid, has been arrested and is facing court-martial. The territorial government is preparing an official apology and reparations for the Lakota Nation." Red Elk closed his eyes, feeling 5 years of grief and rage finally begin to transform into something else. Not quite forgiveness, but acceptance. Justice delayed was still justice, even if it came too late for those who had died. "What happens to the children now?" he asked quietly. Crawford glanced at the 4 young faces, then back at Red Elk. "That's partly up to them. There are families in the territory who would be honored to raise Thomas Hartwell's children. Good people who could give them homes and education and opportunities." But Red Elk prompted, sensing there was more. But they've made it clear that they want to stay with you, Crawford said with a slight smile. In fact, Elsie has been quite forceful in her arguments on that subject. Red Elk looked at the girl, seeing the determined set of her jaw that reminded him so much of warriors he had known. "Elsie, we talked about it," she said, speaking for all of them. "We know it won't be easy living with the Lakota. We know we'll have to learn new ways, new languages. But you saved us when no one else would. You're our family now. The tribal council has already voted," Crawford added. "If you're willing to take them, they're willing to accept them. All 4 children would become members of the Lakota Nation with all the rights and responsibilities that entails." Red Elk felt his throat tighten with emotion. His people, despite their own losses and grievances, were willing to open their hearts to these white children who had lost everything. It was the kind of generosity that made him proud to be Lakota. "What about you?" he asked the children. "Are you sure this is what you want? It's not just about living with me. It's about becoming part of a different culture, leaving behind the world you knew." "We already left that world behind," Sammy said quietly. "When they killed Papa, when they burned our house, when they hunted us like animals. The world we knew doesn't exist anymore. Besides," Agnes added, "you taught us something important. Family isn't just about blood. It's about people who choose to stand together when everything else falls apart." Little Ruth nodded solemnly, still clutching her corn-husk doll. "We choose you," she said simply. "We choose to be your family." Over the following weeks, as Red Elk's strength slowly returned and the legal proceedings continued, the full scope of Morrison and Pike's criminal network became clear. The trafficking operation had been stealing lives and destroying families for years, targeting immigrants, Native Americans, and anyone else who wouldn't be missed by the authorities. The revelation sent shockwaves through the territorial government and led to sweeping reforms in law enforcement and oversight. New protections were put in place for vulnerable populations, and a special commission was established to investigate similar corruption in other territories. Amos Price, whose undercover work had been crucial in exposing the conspiracy, was promoted to Deputy U.S. Marshal and tasked with rooting out corruption throughout the region. He visited Red Elk and the children regularly, becoming an unofficial uncle to the makeshift family. "Never seen anything like it," Price told Red Elk one afternoon as they sat together on the porch of the reservation's medical facility. "The way those kids fought, the way they stuck together through hell itself. And the way you protected them, even when it meant facing impossible odds." Red Elk watched the 4 children playing with some of the tribal children in the yard below. They were beginning to pick up Lakota words and customs, though the process wasn't without its challenges. Agnes had cried herself to sleep several nights, homesick for the father she would never see again. Sammy sometimes woke from nightmares about the night their house was attacked. Even little Ruth occasionally asked when they were going home, not yet fully understanding that home was wherever they were together. "They protected each other," Red Elk said quietly. "And they protected the truth. That took more courage than anything I did." "Don't sell yourself short," Price replied. "You could have walked away when you found them. Could have taken them to the nearest town and let someone else deal with the problem. Instead, you put your life on the line for children who weren't even your own." "They are my own," Red Elk said simply. "The moment I found them in that tent, they became mine, just as I became theirs." Price nodded understanding, passing between the 2 men who had shared danger and emerged with their honor intact. "What will you do now?" Crawford mentioned something about a federal position. Red Elk had been thinking about Marshal Crawford's offer, a role as liaison between tribal councils and federal law enforcement, helping to prevent the kind of corruption that had poisoned Deadwood Gulch. It was important work, necessary work, but it would mean traveling extensively throughout the territory. "The children need stability," he said finally. "They've lost too much already. Whatever I do next, it has to be something that keeps us together." The tribal council's formal adoption ceremony was held on a crisp autumn morning when the leaves were turning gold, and the air carried the promise of winter's approach. Red Elk stood beside the 4 children as the elders performed the ancient rituals that would make them Lakota, not just in name, but in spirit. Each child received a traditional name alongside their birth name, chosen to reflect their character and the role they had played in bringing justice to light. Sammy became Brave Heart for his leadership during their ordeal. Agnes was named Steady Hand for her quiet strength under pressure. Elsie became Keeper of Truth in honor of her father's letter and her own courage in protecting it. And little Ruth was given the name Dawn Light because she represented hope for the future. But the ceremony was more than just formal adoption. It was a healing ritual for everyone involved. Red Elk felt the last of his 5-year-old grief finally begin to lift as he accepted these new responsibilities. The children found the stability and love they needed to begin processing their trauma. And the Lakota community, still healing from their own losses, found purpose in helping these young ones rebuild their lives. As winter settled over the reservation, Red Elk established a routine that balanced respect for Lakota traditions with acknowledgement of the children's heritage. They learned to speak Lakota, but continued their English studies. They participated in tribal ceremonies, but also maintained memories of their father through stories and keepsakes. The adjustment wasn't always smooth. Elsie struggled with nightmares and sudden bursts of anger that reminded everyone how much trauma she carried. Sammy sometimes withdrew into himself, bearing the weight of being the man of the family at far too young an age. Agnes worried constantly about being a burden, working too hard to prove her worth. And Ruth, despite her resilience, occasionally asked heartbreaking questions about why bad men had hurt their papa. But they were healing slowly and imperfectly, supported by a community that understood loss and recovery. One evening in late winter, as snow fell gently outside their lodge, Red Elk sat with the children around the fire that had become the center of their new life together. It was storytelling time, their nightly ritual of sharing the day's events and the deeper truths that shaped their understanding of the world. "Tell us about Papa," Agnes asked, as she did most nights. "Tell us about how brave he was." Red Elk looked into the fire, choosing his words carefully. "Your father was the bravest man I never met," he said. "He saw injustice and refused to turn away, even knowing the cost. He chose to stand up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves, and he died so that the truth could survive, like you did for us." Ruth said, her small voice clear in the firelight. "We protected each other," Red Elk corrected gently. "That's what families do. That's what your father would have wanted for you to find, people who would stand with you when the world turned dark." Elsie leaned against his shoulder, something she had begun doing as her trust in him deepened. "Red Elk Marshal Crawford came by again today. He said they need your help with something happening in Colorado Territory." Red Elk had heard about the troubles in Colorado, reports of missing tribal members, corrupt officials, the same patterns that had plagued Deadwood Gulch. Crawford wanted him to investigate, to use his unique perspective to root out corruption before it could spread. "Would you understand if I had to travel sometimes?" he asked carefully. If the work meant being away from home for short periods. All 4 children nodded solemnly. They were old enough now to understand that some fights were bigger than any individual, that justice sometimes required sacrifice. "Could we help?" Sammy asked with earnest determination. "We know what it's like to be hunted, to be afraid. We could help other families who are in trouble." Red Elk felt his throat tighten with pride and love. These children, who had lost so much and suffered so deeply, were already thinking about how they could protect others. Their capacity for compassion, despite everything they had endured, was perhaps the greatest testament to their father's legacy. "When you're older," he promised, "when you're ready, there will always be families who need justice, children who need protecting. Your father's fight doesn't end with us, it continues through us." As spring returned to the Dakota Territory, Red Elk made his decision. He would accept Crawford's offer, but on his terms. Instead of traveling constantly, he would establish a school on the reservation, a place where both Lakota and white children could learn together, where the lessons of justice and compassion could be passed on to the next generation. The Hartwell Red Elk School, as it came to be known, opened its doors that autumn with 4 very special students among its first class. Elsie proved to be a natural teacher herself, helping younger children learn to read while sharing stories that bridged the gap between cultures. Sammy showed remarkable aptitude for law and governance, already talking about becoming a territorial judge someday. Agnes discovered a gift for healing arts, working with the tribal medicine women to learn both traditional and modern medical techniques. And Ruth, now 8 years old, became the school's unofficial ambassador, making friends with every child regardless of background or heritage. The school's reputation spread quickly throughout the territory. Families traveled great distances to enroll their children in an institution that promised not just education, but wisdom, the kind of deep understanding that came from people who had survived darkness and chosen light. Marshal Crawford visited regularly, bringing cases that needed Red Elk's insight and cultural knowledge. Together, they developed new protocols for investigating crimes against tribal populations, ensuring that justice was truly blind to race or social status. But perhaps the most meaningful vindication came 2 years after the battle at the trading post, when Captain Harrison was finally court-martialed for his role in the attack on Red Elk's village. The officer's conviction and sentencing to 20 years in military prison represented more than just punishment. It was official acknowledgement that the lives lost in that snowy clearing 5 years ago had mattered. On the anniversary of that attack, Red Elk stood with his adopted children at the memorial the tribe had erected for those who died. The simple stone markers bore names in both Lakota and English, a reminder that these had been real people, with families' dreams and futures stolen by greed and corruption. "Do you miss them?" Elsie asked quietly, her hand slipping into his. "Your wife and daughter?" "Every day," Red Elk replied honestly. "But I've learned something important. Missing someone doesn't have to mean being trapped by grief. It can mean honoring their memory by protecting others who need protection." "Is that why you saved us?" Sammy asked. Red Elk considered the question carefully. "I saved you because it was right. Because children should not pay for the sins of adults. Because the spirits brought us together for a reason I'm still learning to understand." Little Ruth looked up at him with eyes that held wisdom far beyond her years. "Maybe the reason was that we all needed each other. You needed us to help heal your heart, and we needed you to keep us safe." "Maybe so, little star," Red Elk agreed, wrapping his arms around all 4 children. "Maybe so." As they stood together before the memorial, Red Elk felt the presence of his first family, not as ghosts demanding vengeance, but as spirits offering blessing. Ayanna and Winona were at peace, now knowing that their husband and father had found a way to transform grief into love loss, into purpose. The wind carried the sound of children's laughter from the school below, where Lakota and white students played together without regard for the prejudices that had nearly destroyed them all. It was the sound of hope, of healing, of a future built on the foundation of justice and understanding that Thomas Hartwell had died to preserve. Years later, when visitors asked about the origins of the remarkable school that had become a model for the entire territory, they would hear the story of a Lakota warrior who found 4 children in a snowy tent and chose to expose a territory's forgotten sins rather than look the away. They would learn about the shopkeeper who died for truth, the children who carried that truth through hell, and the bonds of love that could form between the most unlikely people in the darkest times. But those who knew the family personally understood that the real miracle wasn't the exposure of corruption or the punishment of criminals. It was the simple fact that out of tremendous loss had come tremendous love, that 4 orphaned children and 1 grieving warrior had found in each other the healing that none of them could have achieved alone. Red Elk's hair was beginning to show gray at the temples now, and the children were growing tall and strong. but every evening still found them gathered around the fire for stories and quiet conversation. The ritual had become sacred to them, a time for remembering the past while planning for the future. "What will you do when we're grown?" Agnes asked one night, her voice carrying the bittersweet awareness that childhood was finite. "What any father does," Red Elk replied with a smile. "Worry about you, be proud of you, and trust that everything I taught you will help you make the world a little better than you found it." "And if we have children of our own someday," Elsie asked, "then you'll tell them about their grandfather Thomas, who died for justice, about the night we found each other in the snow, about what it means to stand up for those who can't stand up for themselves." "Will you tell them too?" Ruth asked. Red Elk pulled her close, feeling the weight of years and love and responsibility that had shaped them all. "As long as I have breath, little star. As long as I have breath." Outside, the Dakota wind carried the scent of spring grass and wildflowers, the promise of new growth emerging from ground that had been frozen and barren. It was the smell of hope, of renewal, of the endless cycle that turned sorrow into strength and strangers into family. The letter that had started it all was now preserved in the territorial archives, a testament to one man's courage and the price of truth. But its real legacy lived on in the 4 children who had grown into young adults, dedicated to justice in the school that taught tolerance and understanding, and in the simple knowledge that even in the darkest times, there were those willing to risk everything for the sake of the innocent. Red Elk closed his eyes and listened to the soft breathing of his sleeping children, surrounded by the peace that came from knowing he had kept his promise. The spirits had brought them together for healing, for justice, and for love. The circle was complete, but the story continued in every child who learned that families were made by choice as much as blood, in every stand taken against corruption and cruelty, in every moment when compassion triumphed over fear. "Inamitakuye o yasing," he whispered to the night wind, the words carrying all the love and gratitude his heart could hold. "All my relations." The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, bearing witness to the truth that some bonds were stronger than blood, some families were forged in fire. And some stories ended not with victory or defeat, but with the quiet recognition that love once kindled could burn forever. In the distance, a wolf howled, not the threatening sound of that first night, but the gentle call of a pack calling its members home. Red Elk smiled and settled deeper into sleep, surrounded by his children, and warmed by the knowledge that home was wherever they were together, and together was how they would always be. The story was complete. The truth had prevailed. And in a small corner of the vast Dakota territory, 4 children slept safely in the knowledge that they were loved, protected, and finally truly home.